Good evening. Many mainstream analyses of the current crisis are missing a critical documented pattern in how this administration executes military decisions. They are failing to connect President Trump's current location and recent statements with a historical operational blueprint that has consistently preceded major military actions. Today is Friday, May 15th, 2026. President Trump is currently aboard Air Force One, somewhere over the Pacific, returning from Beijing. These three facts, placed in the same frame at the same moment, represent the most consequential convergence of operational indicators this conflict has produced since the opening night of Operation Epic Fury. This is not speculation or an analysis of intentions. It is a documented operational record from every major military action this administration has executed. President Trump has a consistent preference for initiating military operations as weekends begin. This timing ensures the New York Stock Exchange is closed, preventing the financial system from reacting in real time to news of resumed strikes. It also allows the operational picture to develop across Saturday and Sunday before Monday's market open processes the economic implications. On this specific Friday, May 15th, 2026, President Trump is not in Washington. He is airborne, heading home from the most consequential bilateral summit in a decade. And he just made a statement on camera to reporters aboard Air Force One that has closed the diplomatic track more completely than any previous statement in this conflict. He stated that Iran's latest peace proposal was so unacceptable that if he did not like the first sentence, he threw the entire thing away. When asked what the first sentence said, he answered that it contained something about nuclear issues that was unacceptable. He claimed Iran had agreed to no nuclear in the first sentence and then took it back. He said 20 years is enough, but it has got to be a real 20 years, not a performance of 20 years. He added that they have to get all the fuel out, no more. And then he delivered the detail that changes the entire strategic calculation of this conflict's next phase. Iran, he reported, told him directly, the only one that can remove the nuclear material is China or the United States. We're the only ones with the equipment. They said, you are right. It is a complete obliteration. He continued, they agreed to it, but then they took it back. But they will agree to it eventually. A sitting American president, returning from Beijing on a Friday, with Israel on its highest state of military alert, with the United States airlift accelerating into the region, with fewer than 5 ships transiting a strait that normally sees 130 per day, just said the word, eventually. And in the context of everything else happening simultaneously at this specific moment, eventually is not a diplomatic timeline. It is an operational one. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why the specific combination of what President Trump said, the day it was said, who said it, where he was when he said it, what the military posture surrounding it looks like, and whatever relevant behavioral indicator from Israel to the Persian Gulf is signaling simultaneously, you need to understand the full picture of how this conflict arrived at this exact moment, and what the next 24 to 36 hours are actually deciding for the entire regional order. Here is where things stand as of May 15th. 2026. And every single number in this picture needs to be held in the same frame simultaneously. Merchant vessel traffic in the Strait of Hormuz over the last 24 hours totaled fewer than 5 vessels transiting inbound or outbound. A normal 24-hour period in the Strait sees 130 ships. Before this conflict began, the Strait was handling approximately 3,000 vessel transits per month. The commercial heartbeat of approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply and comparable proportions of global liquefied natural gas and other critical commodities. Less than 5 ships in 24 hours is not a disrupted shipping corridor. It is a commercially dead waterway. This dramatic reduction in traffic is unprecedented, even in previous periods of high tension in the Gulf. It signals a level of commercial risk aversion that far exceeds typical responses to regional instability, suggesting an implicit understanding among global shipping firms that a major escalation is not just possible, but imminent. Every vessel that did transit in that 24-hour window was using the Iranian traffic separation scheme, meaning every commercial operator willing to move through the strait is doing so under the Iranian coordination requirement that constitutes the toll charging structure that the Beijing summit jointly condemned and that President Xi Jinping told President Trump he does not like. The United States airlift operation is continuing and accelerating at this hour. More refueling tankers and cargo planes are moving into the region, positioning the weapons, fuel, spare parts, and personnel that operational readiness at the scale of the incoming phase requires. Israel has entered its highest state of military alert going into this specific weekend. Israeli President Isaac Herzog has canceled his planned trip to New York next week, his office citing circumstances preventing the visit. When heads of state cancel scheduled international travel without providing a specific alternative reason, the cancellation is being driven by an assessment that their presence in their own country during the coming days matters more than any planned diplomatic engagement abroad. An Iranian major general has threatened that faith gives Iran confidence in victory and invoked Iran's ability to deliver an F-5 fighter to American positions. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi has stated that Iran has postponed nuclear talks and will prioritize Hormuz reopening and sanctions relief before any nuclear discussions. And President Trump is on Air Force One on a Friday, having rejected a peace proposal by its first sentence, saying Iran will agree eventually. That is the complete operational picture. Now let's take it apart layer by layer. The Air Force One comments are the most analytically important statements President Trump has made about this conflict since he authorized Operation Epic Fury on February 28th. Not because they represent a new position, but because they reveal in specific operational detail exactly what Iran offered, exactly where the proposal failed, and exactly what Iran acknowledged in direct communication with the American president about the state of its own nuclear infrastructure. Let's go through each element precisely, because each one carries its own strategic weight. President Trump said, if he does not like the first sentence, he throws the entire thing away. That is the most direct possible statement of how thoroughly Iran's proposal failed to meet the minimum threshold for serious engagement. Not negotiating room was insufficient, not the proposal needed revisions. If the first sentence does not meet the standard, the document does not exist as a negotiating instrument. It is garbage. The first sentence apparently dealt with the nuclear question. Iran agreed to no nuclear, but the level of guarantee was described as unacceptable. President Trump said, 20 years is enough, but it has got to be a real 20 years. This is the most specific official American statement about the duration requirement for a nuclear pause that has been made publicly in this conflict. 20 years is sufficient if the verification architecture makes it real. What makes it real is removing the enriched uranium stockpile, dismantling the enrichment infrastructure, accepting the inspection regime that provides confidence. The pause is genuine rather than performative. What makes it unreal is a paper commitment to pause enrichment while the enriched material remains in Iranian possession. The production infrastructure remains intact, and the verification framework is structured to be evaded rather than enforced. Iran's proposal offered the unreal version and called it a 20-year commitment. President Trump threw it away at the first sentence. But the most operationally significant disclosure in the entire Air Force One exchange is the one that most coverage has treated as a secondary detail. Iran told President Trump directly that it cannot remove its nuclear material because it does not have the technology. The only entities with the equipment capable of removing it are China or the United States. And then, in Iran's own words, as President Trump reported them, "You were right. It is a complete obliteration." Read what that admission means for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' institutional survival calculation. The nuclear program that Vahidi's command structure has been treating as the non-negotiable red line, the institutional justification for the IRGC's existence as a governing force that cannot be surrendered in any diplomatic framework, is so obliterated that Iran's own government acknowledges that restoring it to a state where domestic removal of the enriched material is technically possible requires foreign assistance from one of the two countries that bombed it. The IRGC is protecting the status of a nuclear program that its own foreign minister has confirmed to the American president is too destroyed for Iran to clean up without help. That is not a negotiating position. That is the confession of an organization that is performing capability it no longer possesses. Now let's talk about what the ceasefire actually was, because President Trump's Air Force One characterization of it is the most honest official account of the ceasefire's origin and purpose that has been produced since April 7th, and it fundamentally reframes every diplomatic analysis that has been built around the ceasefire as a genuine mutual decision. President Trump said, and this deserves the full quotation, "We really did the ceasefire at the request of other nations. I wouldn't have really been in favor of it, but we did it as a favor to Pakistan, terrific people, the Field Marshal and the Prime Minister." Break that down sentence by sentence. The ceasefire was done at the request of other nations, not because military objectives were achieved, not because both sides were ready to negotiate, not because conditions on the ground created an opportunity for a diplomatic process. At the request of other nations, a multilateral diplomatic favor delivered to Pakistan's Field Marshal and Prime Minister specifically. And then, crucially, President Trump says, "I would not have really been in favor of it." This statement is highly unusual for a commander-in-chief discussing a major military pause. It suggests a transactional, rather than strategic basis for the ceasefire, implying that its continuation is contingent on the political utility of the favor rather than any inherent military or diplomatic advantage for the United States. The ceasefire that has been framing the last several weeks of this conflict, that has been the nominal container within which every peace proposal has been submitted and rejected, that has been the framework that Pakistani mediators have been working to extend and build upon, is a ceasefire that the American commander-in-chief describes as something he would not have been in favor of absent the specific request from Pakistan's leadership. That framing has an endpoint. When the favor's productive phase is complete, when the diplomatic space the ceasefire created has been used without producing a result that justifies maintaining it, the favor expires on its own terms. President Trump is on Air Force One, having received a proposal he rejected by its first sentence. The favor's productive phase has ended. The endpoint is visible in the acceleration of the United States airlift and the state of Israel's highest military alert. Now, let's get into what Israel's actually preparing for and why the specific targeting priorities Israel is pushing for in. The next round reveal the strategic evolution of the conflict's next phase beyond what Operation Epic Fury addressed. Israel is pushing to hit Iranian energy and infrastructure in the next round of strikes, specifically the kind of targets that include power generation, oil processing, and critical supply infrastructure of the kind that President Trump referenced in early April when discussing the prospect of targeting power plants and bridges in a way that ultimately did not materialize in the ceasefire's opening phase. The intelligence and strategic logic driving Israel's preference for this targeting approach in the next round is specifically about regime destabilization rather than military degradation. Admiral Cooper told Congress that 90% of Iran's defense industrial base has been destroyed and that the IRGC's fast attack boat presence in the Strait has declined from 20 to 40 boats per typical transit to 2 or 3. The military degradation phase of Operation Epic Fury accomplished its stated objectives in less than 40 days. What the military degradation phase has not accomplished is the political outcome that makes the conflict's resolution durable rather than temporary. The IRGC can function as an institutional governing force with reduced military hardware because its institutional power does not depend on maintaining a specific weapons inventory. It depends on maintaining the domestic suppression architecture, the economic monopoly, and the legitimacy narrative that allows it to govern the Iranian population. Striking power plants, oil processing facilities, and critical infrastructure converts the external military pressure into domestic political crisis at Echishia. Speed and visibility that the blockade's slow economic strangulation achieves over months rather than days. When the lights go out, when the fuel for heating and cooking stops arriving, when the water treatment infrastructure fails, the population's experience of the regime's collapse becomes immediate and personal rather than statistical and abstract. Israel's preference for this targeting approach reflects a judgment that the military phase has done what military phases can do, and that achieving the political outcome requires the targeting. Philosophy that makes the regime's failure to deliver basic services impossible to manage through propaganda. The American concern about this approach, specifically that striking Iranian energy infrastructure could trigger Iranian retaliation against Gulf energy sites and produce an oil price spike that creates domestic political pressure in consuming countries, is the constraint that has prevented the energy infrastructure approach from being adopted in the current conflict's military phase. That concern is real. Qatar has projected 2 to 3 years of elevated energy prices even after the Strait reopens. Adding Iranian energy infrastructure strikes to the current picture could spike prices from the current elevated levels into ranges that produce global economic disruption on a timeline that creates political problems for every government whose population pays for energy at the retail level. But the constraint exists in tension with the operational logic that without addressing the IRGC's domestic governing capacity, rather than just its military capacity, any ceasefire or negotiated agreement produces a temporary pause rather than a durable resolution. Israel's cancellation of presidential international travel and its highest military alert going into this weekend suggests that the tension between these two competing considerations is being resolved in a specific direction in the Israeli assessment of what President Trump will authorize. Now let's get into Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement, because the specific language he chose deserves analytical attention proportionate to its strategic significance. Netanyahu said, "The campaign is not yet over, but it is already clear that we have changed the history of the State of Israel." That formulation contains two separate claims. The campaign is not yet over, is the operational claim. It explicitly describes the current moment as a pause in a campaign rather than the conclusion of one. It is the Israeli Prime Minister publicly stating that what has been called a ceasefire is, from the Israeli government's perspective, an interval within an ongoing campaign rather than the end of one. The second claim, "We have already changed the history of the State of Israel," is the strategic assessment. It describes the destruction of Iran's naval capacity, its air force, its underground missile cities, and 90% of its defense industrial base as a transformation of Israel's strategic environment that is already accomplished regardless of what happens next. The obliteration of Iran's ability to project power at scale against Israel, the elimination of Hezbollah's funding supply chain and operational logistics, the degradation of the proxy network that represented Iran's primary deterrent against Israeli action. All of this is, in Netanyahu's assessment, already achieved and already history-changing. What remains, the not yet over part, is the completion of the campaign in ways that extend the changed history into a durable strategic outcome rather than a temporary military advantage that regenerates as the IRGC reconstitutes. The highest military alert and the canceled New York trip are Israel's preparation for the not yet over part that Netanyahu has publicly described as coming. Now, let's talk about Foreign Minister Araghchi's response to the Air Force One rejection, because the Iranian foreign minister's public positioning in the hours after President Trump's comments reveals the full depth of the disconnect between what the civilian diplomatic faction can offer and what the IRGC command structure will authorize it to deliver. Araghchi said Iran has postponed nuclear talks. He said Iran will prioritize negotiations on the Strait of Hormuz reopening, sanctions relief, and oil exports before any nuclear discussions. And he said Iran is ready to return to fighting, but also ready for diplomatic solutions. Let's address each of these in sequence. Postponing nuclear talks is not a negotiating tactic. It is a confession that the IRGC has not authorized Araghchi to negotiate on the nuclear question at all. You postpone something when you intend to return to it on a more favorable timeline, but there is no more favorable timeline for Iran on the nuclear question. Every passing day of the blockade makes Iran's economic position weaker. Every passing day of blockade enforcement makes the well-shut-down threshold at Karg Island closer. Every passing day of the ceasefire makes the American military's operational preparation for the next phase more complete. If nuclear talks are being postponed, they are being postponed into a timeline that is uniformly worse for Iran's negotiating position than the current moment. The only reason to postpone nuclear talks in those conditions is if the entity controlling the decision, the IRGC command structure, has concluded that any nuclear discussion is more dangerous to institutional survival than any conceivable improvement in the negotiating environment, which is exactly what Vahidi's calculus has been throughout this conflict. Prioritizing Hormuz reopening and sanctions relief before nuclear is the proposal that President Trump rejected by its first sentence. Asking for economic relief before nuclear concessions is not a sequencing preference. It is a request to remove all pressure before discussing the reason the pressure was applied, which is the non-starter that every previous Iranian proposal has embedded in some form, and that has produced the same response in every iteration. And ready to return to fighting, but also ready for diplomatic solutions, is the statement of a diplomat who cannot deliver the diplomatic solution he knows is required and is performing readiness. For conflict to an IRGC domestic audience that needs to believe its foreign minister is still fighting rather than acknowledging that the position is untenable. Now let's get into the Iranian general's F-5, because this specific statement is the most revealing single indicator of the IRGC's psychological and institutional state available in the current public record. Iran's Major General Hatami stated that faith gives confidence in victory, and that Iran can deliver an F-5 fighter to American positions in Kuwait despite their most advanced defense systems. The F-5 Freedom Fighter is a 1960s-era American-designed light fighter aircraft that entered service with the Iranian Air Force under the Shah before the 1979 revolution, and that Iran has kept in operational condition through decades of domestic maintenance and modification, despite the sanctions embargo on American military spare parts and technical assistance. It is not a stealth aircraft. It is not a fifth-generation fighter. It is not equipped with advanced avionics beyond visual range missile systems or electronic warfare capabilities. It is a 50-year-old light fighter aircraft that represents the upper capability tier of what remains of the Iranian Air Force after Operation Epic Fury destroyed Iran's Air Force in the opening phase of the campaign. The invocation of a 50-year-old F-5 fighter as a credible threat against modern American air defenses is a stark indicator of the IRGC's profound disconnect from contemporary military realities. It suggests a propaganda-driven narrative for domestic consumption, rather than a genuine assessment of operational capability, highlighting the regime's desperation to project strength it no longer possesses. The senior Iranian military official presenting the delivery of this aircraft to American positions in Kuwait as evidence of military capability, as the demonstration that should give confidence and victory, is presenting the operational equivalent of a general boasting about cavalry, while his opponent is operating F-35s against 53 F-16 at Prince Sultan Air Base, against F-35s, F-22s, F-15Es, and B-1B Lancers being restocked with 30,000-pound bunker busters, against 3 carrier strike groups with more than 200 fifth-generation aircraft aboard. The IRGC general's confidence in delivering an F-5 is the public performance of an organization that has lost its Navy, its Air Force, its anti-aircraft systems, and 90% of its defense industrial base, and is performing capability for a domestic audience through the only medium it still controls: the state media broadcast of a uniformed general saying the word faith. Now let's give you the full operational numbers picture, because placing every relevant quantitative indicator in the same frame reveals the geometric shape of what has been produced and what is being prepared. Less than 5 ships in the Strait against a baseline of 130 in the last 24 hours. 159 Iranian naval vessels at the bottom of the sea per President Trump's Air Force One statement. 90% of Iran's defense industrial base destroyed per Admiral Cooper's congressional testimony. 20 to 40 fast attack boats per typical Strait transit, reduced to 2 or 3 per Cooper's testimony. 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan Air Base confirmed by satellite imagery. 67 ships turned around by the blockade since April 13th, with 4 disabled for non-compliance. $4.8 billion in Iranian oil revenue lost in the blockade's first 18 days. $500 million per day in combined blockade losses compounding daily. The 71-kilometer oil slick spreading off Karg Island, confirming that the storage crisis has reached a stage where oil has nowhere to go. Fewer than 5 ships in the Strait in the last 24 hours against a pre-conflict baseline of approximately 3,000 per month. 2 to 3 years of elevated energy prices projected by Qatar even after the Strait reopens. 230-plus non-Iranian Gulf producer tankers trapped inside the Strait. The United States airlift accelerating with more tankers and cargo planes moving at this hour. Israel on highest military alert. Israeli president canceling New York trip. Netanyahu saying the campaign is not yet over. B-1B Lancers on training runs that track toward the eastern Mediterranean. GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators restocked under a $100+ million contract. Operation Sledgehammer named and discussed at the Pentagon. President Trump on Air Force One on a Friday, having rejected a proposal by its first sentence. Every number in that list points in the same direction. Every indicator in that list is expressing the same operational trajectory. And the only variable that cannot be read from publicly available information is the specific timing of when President Trump lands, reviews whatever final briefings are waiting, and makes the decision that every other indicator is pointing toward. Now let's bring all 3 tracks together into the complete strategic picture, because understanding the full convergence is the only way to understand the magnitude of what the next 24 to 36 hours are deciding. The financial track is at its most advanced stage of strategic effectiveness. The blockade has cost Iran $4.8 billion in the first 18 days of full enforcement. At $500 million per day in combined import and export capacity denial, the accumulated damage since April 13th has reached a level that the regime's own economic officials have described as requiring a decade to recover from. The Karg Island storage crisis has produced the oil slick that satellite imagery confirms is spreading and growing. Loading operations at Karg Island have halted with no tankers present in multiple consecutive satellite observations. The well shutdown threshold is approaching. Iran has acknowledged to President Trump directly that its nuclear infrastructure is so obliterated that only China or the United States has the equipment to clean it up. The financial track is not producing diplomatic capitulation on the administration's timeline, but it is producing the irreversible infrastructure damage that makes Iran's post-conflict recovery progressively more difficult with each day the blockade continues. The military track is at operational readiness for the next phase. 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan, United States airlift accelerating, Israel on highest alert. Netanyahu saying the campaign is not yet over, Israeli president canceling international travel. B-1B training sorties over the eastern Mediterranean. GBU-57 restocked. Operation Sledgehammer named. The 5 ships against 130 Strait transit ratio, confirming that the blockade's enforcement architecture is functioning at maximum operational effectiveness. The diplomatic track has reached its terminal phase, Iran's proposal rejected by its first sentence. Araghchi postponing nuclear talks while claiming readiness to fight. President Trump saying they will agree eventually from an Air Force One posture that is not waiting for eventually to arrive on Iran's timeline. The ceasefire confirmed as a favor done for Pakistan that President Trump would not have agreed to otherwise. And President Xi Jinping's offer to help sitting in the diplomatic background as a factor that has not changed the operational trajectory on a timeline that the airlift acceleration and the Israeli alert and the canceled diplomatic trips are all measuring. Here is the honest assessment of what the next 24 to 36 hours are deciding. There are multiple potential triggers in the current operational picture, any one of which is sufficient to produce the resumed operations that Israel is on highest alert to participate in. The IRGC sank the Indian-flagged Hajj Ali with an anti-ship cruise missile in the last 48 hours. The IRGC hijacked the Honduran-flagged Huxiang floating armory in the same window. Iran is loading crude oil tankers for another attempt to break the blockade, 4 of which have previously been disabled by American forces using exhaust stack targeting. The IRGC has announced that vessels transiting the strait must coordinate with the Iranian Navy, asserting the toll-charging structure that President Xi Jinping told President Trump he does not like, and that the Beijing summit's joint statement explicitly condemned. Any one of these Iranian actions in the current political and military context provides the documented justification for the operational authorization that Israel has moved to highest alert to execute, that the United States airlift is accelerating to support, and that President Trump has described in terms of a proposal so bad he threw it away at the first sentence, and an Iranian acknowledgement that only Chinese or American equipment can remove what remains of its obliterated nuclear infrastructure. The campaign is not yet over. The airlift is accelerating. The Strait has fewer than 5 ships. President Trump is on Air Force One. It is a Friday, and Iran just confirmed to the American president that it cannot even clean up its own nuclear program without foreign help. The word eventually is doing a lot of work in President Trump's Air Force One statement, and the military posture surrounding it suggests that the timeline eventually is working on is considerably shorter than the word itself implies.